Hey there, Michael.
Hi, sorry, my audio was just connecting. I've got on. Good evening, good morning, everyone. And I've set the meeting up in the event that I'm unable to make it, like last week when I was traveling, that it will automatically begin recording. So it should open whenever anyone joins, and it should begin recording right away as well. And then after the meeting, I can collect the recording and post it to the YouTube channel where I posted the other recordings. And I was just chatting with Howard on Slack, so I presume he's just a few minutes away. All right.
Hi, guys.
Hey, good evening, Howard. Or good morning, I should say.
Yeah, good morning. I'm stuck in Dublin now due to the the beast from the east.
I'm further south from where that's coming in, but I assume that's Erica and maybe a bit of Khaled affected by that.
What am I affected by?
I had heard that there was a large storm being referred to as a beast from the east coming up towards the way. Maybe I haven't paid enough attention to the weather. I thought that's what Howard was referring to.
It has not at least hit here yet. It was kind of a pleasant day.
Excellent.
Yeah, well, there's a massive airline cancellation here.
It's pretty late in Ireland, isn't it?
It's 1 morning.
Oh my.
Yeah.
Still awake?
Or Khalid, can you help share the screen? Or I can?
Sure. Either way.
Let me see. Oh, okay, I can. Okay, great. I can share. So can you record? Let me see if I can record.
So Howard, I was just mentioning that before. So
I can
first
record.
off, apologies for kind of confusion last week, but I've set up the meeting now so that it should open when anyone joins, and it will automatically begin recording right away. Then
Okay,
after the meeting, I can collect the recording and publish it to the YouTube channel and add it to the playlist.
Ah, great. So it's being recorded now, right?
That's correct. It'll record from the very first person joining.
Ah, wonderful. Okay, so let's start the meeting, and please write down your name on the note. First item on the agenda, some progress update. So we got the working group sessions in KubeCon, actually 2 sessions if you search policy working group on the official schedule. We have an introduction session and a deep dive session. So pretty good, as I said last week. And the second thing is I received an email about there's a opportunity provided by the CNCF that we can do one article about 800 1,500 words, that long article for basically PR for your topic on KubeCon. So since our topics are official working group sessions, so I was thinking about just drafting a article on our working group together. So anyone interested in co-authoring this article, please sign below, and then I can start offline. Let's start drafting.
I think that'd be fine. I would suggest we start with what we have in some of the mission statement and kind of crafting that into the article flow and kind of just highlighting what we saw as the problems and what we see as the mission, and then what we're soliciting in terms of contributions in the community would probably fill out 800 words pretty quickly.
Oh yeah, definitely. So just please sign below so that I can directly coordinate offline. Okay, I think the deadline is somewhere mid-April. Yeah, should be okay for us to draft a short article. Okay. Okay. Let's get into business. So we have thanks to Erica, Khalid, and Michael, we have 2 use case template up. Which one do you guys want to discuss first? Capacity or compliance?
Well, really quick, I have a slight update on my behalf. Maybe accidentally, I started talking to people at my new employer, and apparently this is a very complicated subject, and I'm talking to lawyers and such next week about exactly what to talk about and what our messaging is around GDPR.
Okay.
So I'm holding off. I don't think it's going to be anything very bad, but everyone is very careful around anything.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so maybe let's start with the capacity.
That might be a good place to start, because I can talk about that one.
Yeah.
Okay. I kind of jotted a few thoughts down. I didn't do the whole template. I just focused more on the scenario and the requirements. This is really kind of an aggregation of things that I've seen and across different clients and working in the industry. My background is a lot of it is in high performance and grid computing, and this is where people have done kind of shared infrastructures for very maybe specialized workloads that are highly parallel calculations and lots of design, simulation, modeling type of workloads. So they have challenges where that when they set these things up, they need to be able to express controls on how the resources are shared. Typically, what happens is that there's different groups, different business units, lines of businesses, and so on, contributing to a shared infrastructure. And they want to be kind of guaranteed certain amounts of capacity. But the central IT organization also wants to encourage the sharing of resources in order to drive up utilization, right? And save overall costs. So that's kind of the overall goal. So these policies are not, they're not really, new per se, right? I think they've existed in one form or another in different systems, different high performance computing grids and financial systems and so on. So what I'm trying to do is trying to imagine those kinds of systems running on a Kubernetes type of environment, and then looking at the kinds of policies that might have to be enforced to achieve kind of the service level objectives and the goals around utilization and those kinds of things, right? So that's kind of the background. And any questions there or comments?
I have a short question. So this certainly looks like multi-tenancy. So
Yeah, it is a form of multi-tenancy, right? But
Difference
I think,
between the capacity.
yeah, but I guess in this working group, we're trying to capture, for this kind of multi-tenant model, what sorts of policies around capacity allocation would make sense, right? To be able to express, right? I think that's our goal in this use case exercise, right? And to understand what actors in the system would need to do in order to support those kinds of policies.
And part of it too, right, is the trade-offs between which workloads you want to provide higher quality of service to during certain windows where they need additional capacity, and which workloads you're willing to sacrifice or to pause to some extent during that high traffic window to make sure that it doesn't interrupt any of the user traffic coming through the system.
Yeah. So the workloads are one aspect, and who owns those workloads is another aspect, right? So the same, run or application might be running for a particular line of business or a particular project, and they want to be kind of guaranteed some capacity. So there's a bunch of constraints that have to be expressed in the policy. And I guess the back-end engine or engines would have to coordinate to enforce this policy overall, these kinds of policies.
Okay, so if I understand correctly, the relationship between our work here and the multi-tenancy team is that we are going to describe like the policy mechanism,
Correct.
like what people can do, like policy-wise for the multi-tenancy, and the multi-tenancy team basically will working on the basic mechanism itself for the support of multi-tenancy, right?
Yes, I think my impression from the multi-tenancy working group is that it was started mostly for about making sure you could have multi-tenancy, so making sure that you like sandboxing the actual containers and other sort of like little gaps in the technicalities around it. But some of the people who came in, it turns out there's also sort of a management gap of whether the controls are there or not, being able to manage that in a way that makes sense for most multi-tenant environments. It's kind of lacking right now. And I think that's where it directly relates to us.
Cool.
So then just to summarize, Erica, based on that analysis, you've basically highlighted there are some basic mechanics that are required in order to drive multi-tenancy, but I think you would still agree that there's room for us to drive what is the policy that you would lay on top of that mechanical layer of supporting multi-tenancy. How do you actually derive the intent of how you want to slice up quota and how you might want that to change over certain time periods?
Yes, exactly. To be able to have a quota, you need to be able to measure the resources, and that's definitely one component. And then being able to say that you want that quota and enforce it.
Yeah. Like things like time of day variations of the quotas, being able to say that, a certain amount of your quota you may want to lend out to other teams that they can use, and then also in return for doing that, you might get a kind of a preferential rate on the use of those resources. So instead of paying X, you pay 0.9x for that because you were willing to give up those resources, right?
Yes, I think the people who wrote this tenancy proposal doc work at universities, and where they actually have like different research groups with different requirements and different kind of pools, and then they have their grant money, but they would like also to lend out their services, all that kind of stuff.
So I think that's an interesting policy area that we might want to consider in the industry. How do you express that kind of policy, and what's the kind of the model for expressing. One of the things that we've seen is the need for expressing that policy in some sort of hierarchy, because they want to kind of delegate control. So if I'm a line of business, the central IT might delegate, some amount of capacity to a line of business, and the line of business might subdivide it within their project teams and departments and so on.
And I think there's another aspect fall into this group, which is also required by multi-tenancy group, is biosecurity. So regarding the balance between different quotas of different tenancies, there's another important perspective is about the isolation and also security between multi-tenancy users. And I think it's quite important fall into the policy bucket, how we can describe the security with these policies and enforce that.
Yeah, I think that they are related, right? Typically, the model of the lines of businesses and departments and those kinds of things also align with how they want to do like the role-based access control and so on, right? What users and groups they want to give access to that capacity.
So what would be the security aspect that we need to consider from the policy point of view? Do we have some examples?
Yes. So there's a few things the security will take care is basically first thing I think I mentioned is about RBAC. And the other things like the policy security policy, like whether we allow a workload to be run in the privileged pod or with some restrictions and restrict access to certain volume drivers, that kind of stuff. And another thing about is networking. There will be a network policy we can also enforce to set up the firewalls automatically when a namespace is provisioned and provide a better network isolation between different namespaces. And there may be more stuff I can't mention, I can't remember right now. But I feel like the policy model in general can handle this.
So there, though, when we've kind of crossed a little bit from capacity management to security, but maybe what you're really also highlighting, though, is that policies might, when it comes to networking, we might get into throttling policies as well. What's the limit of network bandwidth? Maybe that's part of the quota that would be defined there. I don't know how much, I haven't got deep enough on the layer to know how much Kube network security policies could cover of that today versus having to break down into something like Calico to do it.
They have a lot of gaps,
Spike, if you have
believe. So,
okay.
Yeah, so network policy doesn't cover any quota stuff. It's just about authorization, and even Calico doesn't do any of that stuff at present. We sort of hear from people every once in a while that they want to control how much bandwidth different pods are using.
I guess a zero quota, or like restricting access to something is kind of just a subset of quota. Just a quota.
It's mainly the firewall rules. It basically setting firewalls on ingress and egress. It doesn't talk about the bandwidth.
I think you get into storage level kind of things as well in terms of quotas and those kinds of things. So these things kind of all link together in some form, right? And I guess from our point of view, we need to be able to segment it, but also relate them.
Yeah, I think basically we'll touch like every aspect of life since we're dealing with multi-tenancy. My next question is about the architecture impact. So if borrow from the multi-tenancy architecture, Erica help provide the link. Like, what would be the control point and or decision point and the enforcement point you guys think, for example, if the tenant controller would be the enforcement point that consume the policy from an external policy control entity, what would be the general architecture impact?
Yeah, I think that there is some sort of tenant controller or tenant model that you need. And then there's different levels of like quota management. I think some sort of quota, it exists in Kubernetes today. And then I think you need some level of some arbitrator or some decision maker that is looking at kind of the overall the desired state and adjusting things like quotas and capacity allocations and those kinds of things to meet that service level that is expressed in that desired state.
Does this have to be built into the Kube scheduler in order to work, or is there something less extreme?
I think if you play it out, it would be, right? Because I think if you play it out, part of the goal here, we talk about time-sensitive scheduling or time-sensitive policy. And as I'm skimming the list of policy requirements, Howard, I think that might be one that we might have missed here, but we talked about it. Oh, here we go. Varies by time of day, time of week, month to reflect. Fred should be able to set capacity allocation policy that varies by time of day, week, or month to reflect predicted demand, i.e. end-of-day batch runs, or the HBO use case that we were inspired by for this one was the time when Game of Thrones came out, right?
Yeah.
So in order to really enforce that, Spike, I think you absolutely would have to build a policy definition that lets you drive behavior into the scheduler so that it could dynamically decide, do I hold some of the things that have been requested to be scheduled back until a valid window occurs? And I think really, at least when I suggested this scenario originally, I was trying to think about within 30 minutes to an hour of that window that I know that I'm going to have a lot of new traffic coming in, do I want to sort of slow down how much new work is getting scheduled to the cluster? Or do I want to kind of enforce even somewhat kind of a freeze window 30 minutes before Game of Thrones is supposed to come on, nothing gets added to the cluster. Lower priority workloads may actually get removed and then rescheduled at a later point in time.
Yeah, I think the notion of preemption, being able to kind of look forward in time and preempt resources ahead of when the actual demand comes in is part of that.
Yes, I've run into that problem before where even your load balancers can't scale up fast enough and everything. But is scheduling really still, though, a subset of the sorts of controls you need? For instance, we kind of have touched on the network or storage, which are other sort of aspects. I know also I've heard some people wanting to talk about more like a pluggable scheduler, but is that more of like a mechanism to help achieve what we want rather than something that is?
I think it's a mechanism, but I think Spike was kind of asking, how would you drive that? Would it have to modify the scheduler? Would you have to, just like the quota examples we were talking about earlier, kind of the mechanism for quota versus the policy for quota? I think the time-based windows or the time-based quotas, time-based restrictions, I think that also, the scheduler is just a mechanism. And then we're talking about, or at least trying to get to, how do we define that policy layer on top of it that says, here's the window where I want you to slow down, or here are windows that are frozen,
yes,
or to Khaled's point, here are some workloads that actually I'm willing to take offline in order to give this workload more capacity.
Yes, I think if we are looking at it from, for example, OPA's most use cases, maybe there will be dedicated policy policy control engine, and then the tenant controller here might be the enforcement result that be executed on the policy engine. Yeah, so I think, from Michael's suggestion on, for example, time-based quotas, that begs another question in the next session. How granularity
you
for
cut
the
out for me.
policy for quotas? Yeah, like how specific should we go into when we describe policy for multi-tenancy for the quota?
I don't know if it was everyone, but for me, Howard, there was a midpoint of that sentence that I lost. Your audio cut out there for a second.
Yeah, I missed it.
Could you repeat that?
Yeah, sorry, my network is a bit a problem. So my question is, what would be the correct, like, granular for the policy here? For example,
I'm
you just
catching bits and
mentioned,
pieces of what you
like,
got, Howard, but I think you're asking what's the correct granularity to apply for the policy.
Yeah. So when we describe the policy.
I mean, policies can't be more specific than we have. You can actually like query and know about, but then that's one aspect. But the other aspect is, do we care about how performant calculating policies are? Because that might add additional restrictions onto what kind of things we allow people to specify, or like how often they can change.
I think absolutely. I think to some extent, the set of nouns that a policy may refer to are limited by the set of resource types known to Kubernetes, right? We're at best a subset of those nouns. So we might set policy around namespaces, for example. And I think that's actually, and I apologize, is it Yisu?
Yes.
Okay. That Yisu suggested earlier, right? He was talking about enforce network policy for firewalls when namespaces are coming online. So I think in this case, maybe this particular policy, we could do one of two things. We could really look at capacity scenarios where we're talking about specifically namespaces, persistent storage, and the networking layers, and that's kind of it, right? And so when we think about scheduling, either when a namespace is defined or when I'm scheduling work into a new namespace, et cetera, the policy is going to be something enforced on that. Like if it's within these 7 different windows during the week, don't allow any new workloads to enter this namespace because I know that they're about to kick off some additional work, some batch jobs or something like that. And just to make sure, Erica, is that kind of what you're hinting at? That to Howard's question, how fine-grained are we going to be? I would rather start more large-grained and then refine it over time. And I'd say if we're going to start more large-grained, let's pick the things that people have probably cared the most about managing. I tend to think they care less about managing individual pods, deployments and daemon sets. They know how to handle those. But if we're talking about capacity, I think they're going to care about namespaces, persistent volumes or PVCs maybe, and then networking.
Yeah, that defines one aspect of it, which is kind of like what are your pieces that you can put together into your policies. But I think there's still another part of it about the relationships that you define between all these things and how abstract they can get to be able to calculate whether something fits into that policy or not.
Yeah,
yes.
I mean, typically, I think you would want to, at least as far as capacity goes, you would want to attach some policy if there's going to be some cost associated with it, right? There's actual, physical cost of memory or network bandwidth or storage and so on. That's what ultimately it boils down to. What's your bill that you're giving to the customer, right, or to the tenant? So yeah, I think that focus on those things that have some sort of measurable cost, and because it does relate to the chargeback model and how these organizations measure whether they're doing better than some other provider like an external cloud provider and so on.
Yeah, I feel namespace level is quite reasonable. And there's already building blocks which are all working on namespace level, like the resource quota with resource quota admission control, which it's able to control the resource consumption in a lot of perspectives, including the CPU memory and also storage, all kind of stuff. There's also a lot of stuff which is working on namespace level. Theoretically, I think things should work if we want the pod level, but I doubt if it's necessary to be that fine-grained level. And according to the use case, I see there's mention about the line of business can basically lease the unused capacity to other workloads from other line of business workloads to make the class to be consumed more efficiently. In that case, I'm not sure if namespace will be sufficient to support that. Maybe we should go to a more fine-grained control, maybe on pod level, but I'm not sure.
But so think about that for a second, just to play devil's advocate. If you could declare a policy that declared a certain quality of service expected for, let's call it the Game of Thrones namespace, just to go back to the HBO example from the keynote. And then I had a separate namespace, which might be, what was the one? I'm trying to think of a less popular series. In any case, so I've got Game of Thrones and I've got the B-list series that no one really likes to watch, and I kind of keep the pods which service those things in different namespaces. Could I say that the Game of Thrones namespace should always have higher priority, and if it needs capacity, I'm willing to sacrifice these other namespaces? Or it's probably more likely, rather than in that case the content-centric, it's probably more likely prod versus maybe stage and dev, right? I have one cluster and I have some stage services that I'm sort of slowly rolling out and providing visibility and routing behavior to. And then I have the ones that are actually taking most of the production workload. And maybe in that case, I'm willing to sacrifice some of those other namespaces on behalf of the primary namespaces. So, I mean, even if you just use namespaces without getting down into individual pods, could you not at least leverage that to say, because basically we'd be considering how to dynamically adjust the quota that's enforced in a namespace at any given time?
I think if we take namespaces work, but if we do that, we're moving farther away from having people be able to use namespaces for other reasons. For instance, it would be very hard to just assign teams each their own namespace at that point, because then they would have no mechanism to control all their varying priorities within that. There are other needs for sort of hierarchical and overlapping things. It might be the case that namespace works better for things like quotas and policy, and that other use case should develop a new concept, but there is that kind of trade-off.
Okay, fair enough. So you see, if we kind of elaborate on what you were highlighting there, going down into pods, or are you really kind of talking about going, and I think maybe Erica, this is what you're highlighting, should we actually go up a level to a tenant, because a tenant might correspond to a collection of namespaces, and I'm describing policy within the context of a tenant, so that the tenant can decide how they want to make trade-offs.
Or kind of the combination of the two, probably.
Yeah, I would agree.
I mean, you could, if you wanted to, just use labels on pods and kind of group things, workloads that way, right? And set your quotas and so on based on that.
That's very hard to manage, though, and I think people are overloading and struggling with that right now.
Yeah, I guess, you'd have to have a very strong conventions.
Okay, let's set up some action items. I think this use is really great. Well, so
Howard, your audio is cutting out again. Is it just me who's listening to silence?
Yeah, I'm not hearing him as well.
Okay.
Hopefully he's not talking, thinking we're hearing him.
Hi, can you hear me?
Okay.
Gotcha now.
Yeah, you're back.
Okay, okay. The network is just. I just asked Yi if you would be willing to contribute some example on the security side.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I didn't hear
Network
you.
policy. RBAC.
Sorry, I didn't hear for a few seconds, for a few minutes. So yes, I can do that.
Okay. I should work with Torian and those folks on the architecture impact.
Yes, I was going to say that'd be really good to get some of those OPA people into what the right way to plug in those policy engines.
Yeah.
So I was talking to Doug Davis, who is another IBMer who's involved in the community. He suggested joining one of the weekly architecture or the biweekly architecture calls. He said that they alternate between sort of a set agenda versus more office hours, and that might be the best way if we're looking for some feedback from the architecture SIG on what's going on in this work
Cool,
group.
definitely.
Yes, I should mention I did go to SIG architecture, not this week, but last week, with the intention of just like listening in, like lurking, no one would see, but signed on to the Zoom and there's like 4 other people in that call. So apparently it's not a very popular thing. So
how did the lurking go?
Say that again?
How did the lurking go with only 4 other people? I feel like it's hard to lurk with 4 people.
Yeah, it was, they also really didn't have any agenda items. So got into what is a contributor talk. It ended early and I still made it to stand up on time. So.
Okay, cool.
But if we do
Khaled,
know what we want to go with, I think it'd be very not hard, not like SIG apps or anything where you have to schedule months in advance.
Khaled, is there anything else you'd want to highlight here to help drive out?
No, I think I'll think about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we can go through. I know Erica had some concerns about the GDPR bit. I'm happy to kind of talk through at least what we captured in the document last week. And then
Yeah,
Erica,
sure.
if you want to kind of hang out for that one, that's fine. But before kind of transitioning over, one of my questions, I had intended to go back and get into more detail into the GDPR document, and I did not have the time. Unfortunately, I was traveling last week, and that's on me. But I'm wondering, for things like a policy language, in this next phase, once we kind of work past understanding some of the use cases, what do we consider our next step to be? Do we actually expect that, like, for some of the action items that are being described, we're going to begin to conceptualize a policy definition language, or we're going to begin looking at how specifically OPA applies into the space, or are we going to do something completely different? Or are we really planning to go to KubeCon with use cases defined, being able to describe kind of the intent versus actually show a working example? What do others consider as our kind of target there?
Well, I mean, the goal is to have some proposal for an architecture of how this stuff should work. So ideally, we would have a couple of use cases fleshed out enough that we could then start defining an architecture and evaluating that architecture against the various use cases, and sort of know whether or not the proposed architecture would actually work. Like in terms of actually like defining new policy, like detailed policy for how these different use cases would work. That's probably a longer term goal. After getting an idea of what the architecture would be like, in my opinion, anyway.
So in terms of that architecture, though, then are we saying we're basically going to end up having some designs, some drawings, some pictures that just show here are the pieces we think are important? Or do we actually think that a prototype, even if we're very rough or we have hard-coded policy behavior that's actually implemented in the code itself, just to have something there? Is that, I guess I'm really trying to figure out in my head, and then they also kind of take the temperature, is our goal to have some level of code, even if it's rough and hard-coded, just to kind of show an end-to-end example? Or is our goal just to have the pictures that show how we think this is going to fit into the broader ecosystem, and then solicit people who want to contribute the code to help make it real?
I think that any of these use cases that we have defined are gonna touch a bunch of different places. There are going to be multiple enforcement points that are required, like we've been talking about the scheduler, and there'll be admission control, and there'll probably be, like we talked about, preemptions. You'll have to have some active thing that like is looking at this stuff and deciding what to kill. And so like there's going to be a lot of moving pieces, I think, for these. So it may be possible to prototype them, but unless a single person, a single team, or like single mind is sort of doing that prototyping, I don't think that will work unless we agree on what the architecture looks like at a high level.
Okay,
I
that's
agree.
fair.
Yeah. We.
Okay.
I always
Go ahead.
I always err on the side of code and make it real and demoable, but I will be honest, that's a little overwhelming to me at just how, like, we're still kind of narrowing down a lot. So I really don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think if there are people that are interested in hacking together prototypes for enabling one or more of these use cases, then that's a perfectly valid way to go. But I don't think that like we're going to be able to have the level of coordination to have multiple people from this working group, if they're from different companies, collaborating on a prototype. I think that if there's going to be a prototype, it's kind of got to be somebody sort of hacking their way through it.
Okay, fair enough. All right.
But again, that's just my opinion. So
I think it's valid. I also kind of share Erica's intimidation in terms of being able to pull something running together, because there are so many touch points. I tend to favor, though, if we're going to communicate to other technical individuals, some level of prototype, even if it's just a toy to kind of highlight the idea, can sometimes help make it more real.
I mean, I think once we have that drawing of like, here are the different pieces and what does it have to touch and stuff like that, then it's a lot easier to say, okay, well, somebody prototyped this piece, some other person prototyped this piece. But before you have that, getting that level of coordination with a working group is going to be pretty difficult.
Fair enough. Perfectly fair. Well, let's talk about a little bit in the GDPR side. So a lot of this, to some extent, was making sure that we had talked about the roles of developer and operator, and instead of sticking with just those, GDPR actually defines some very specific business roles that are required. And these might be human beings, or they might be a business entity, but they represent a particular set of concerns. So in this case, the data protection officer which is actually formally defined by part of the GDPR, highlights an individual or a business entity which is really focused on informing and advising and then monitoring for compliance. So the data protection officer is really about setting or helping to provide input to what the policy should be in terms of how, and for folks that maybe aren't as familiar with GDPR, it really is about how do you manage European Union citizen information in terms of identifying properties that might be names, email addresses, it might be even IP addresses that are captured as part of their interaction with the system. How do you ensure that the data is protected? So both encrypting it in transit, encrypting it at rest, following through to have some level of perhaps anomaly detection where you are trying to detect whether the data is being tampered with. And then upon request or trigger, you need to be able to purge any information about that citizen from the system. All right, at a high level, that's kind of at least the value or the push for GDPR. And the thing that makes GDPR scary is that every business organization who is found culpable of a violation for GDPR has a payment of something like 20 million or 4% of their global revenue, whichever is greater. So it's a scary thing. So in any case, that's why I think when I propose this particular use case, I think it's something that for general purpose policy, it's very relevant. How do you actually go and do this? This is not necessarily straightforward. And because it's KubeCon EU, it seemed like appropriately timing the use case to the audience. So with that said, the first role here, the data protection officer, is responsible to do things like the inform and advise of the controller, which we'll talk about in a moment, and then to monitor compliance with the regulation at a high level. So we looked at, okay, well, what would this person do? So use case, and I just started using a couple of labels here. So Howard, I'm looking at, if you scroll down just a tad more, just one more line, these use cases at the bottom, DP01, Data Protection Officer 1. As a data protection officer, she can capture metrics associated with a compliance enforcement to ensure the intended policies are being followed. So I think part of this use case is really how do we provide visibility into what's being done and when certain policies are being enforced, perhaps even when they're being violated, right, for workloads that are running on the platform. And conceptually, the idea is that could you have metadata associated with pods that either monitor or examine how they interact with data? Like, do they expose endpoints that are not TLS secured? Is the storage that they're using leveraging encrypted volumes of some kind, or encryption somewhere in the file system, or encryption somewhere in the application layer? Can you determine that, and then can you report on that? Right, so at a high level, that's kind of DP01. DP02, she can alert when violations occur. If I deploy a new build of my client check transaction workload, and that checking transaction workload then begins to have some data which is not being encrypted or protected, I added a persistent volume claim. The new PVC that was created and bound to the new PV that was created and bound to the PVC was not actually encrypted. That's a problem, right? That represents a violation. Can I alert when I detect that? So that's DP02. DP03, she can generate as needed audit history for all compliance policies which are currently defined, as well as access for any data governed by GDPR. So today, the neat thing, I think that deployments are really neat with their kind of the history of roll forward, roll back, et cetera. So I think here, as we think about creating policies, the DPO should be able to actually go and ask, what's the history of policy changes that have occurred? And in this case, I think also the access log. So GDPR requires that you can go through and track who has read, written, viewed, deleted, modified I guess modified and updated or whatever are the same, but basically who's actually interacted with the data that's under governance. So that might include, can we actually get down to the storage driver layer, right? The CSI actually become one of the control point mechanisms that's interesting to inject the read and the write information so you have a clear audit trail. I know CSI isn't actually always necessarily transmitting the data, but just kind of thinking out loud, like is that a mechanism where you could actually understand, okay, here's all the places where it was written and here's the identity, the actual user identity that's associated with this particular action. So that's what DPO3 is trying to describe.
Yeah, I doubt CSI could be used for logging because CSI is basically used for like volumes, attachment, creating volumes.
Fair enough, but even the basic principles of attaching the volume or deleting can be interesting. But I think about CSI as just the interface, right? The common storage interface. If I wanted to tell a storage provider, you need to maintain an audit history of all of the data access log or all the data access interactions. That may be something that we communicate down through the CSI to a EMC, NetApp, IBM storage, Ceph, whatever backend, and ask it, hey, by the way, this data needs to be encrypted. This data needs to have an access log whenever it's modified.
Oh.
And I'm just kind of thinking out loud there, right? I'm not deep on CSI, so there's pieces there that I might be missing.
I'm not totally very into it, but I think you're on to something that there needs to sort of be one-way enforcement or information flows of some sort that can be enforced. And the other thing, I think we should maybe at some point talk about how we're going to keep track of all the state, whether it's for keeping track of what has happened or for calculating a quota. I think we've kind of escaped how we would actually do that, or if it's an external system. That's kind of a side note, though.
Agreed. I mean, I honestly, I think the picture that we're going to ultimately create and take for review and discussion is going to probably leverage the same pattern with etcd as our stateful mechanism. So in terms of like defining policies and versions of policies, I'm expecting we're not really describing anything that's too far out of the norm. We're going to create new kinds that can be described in YAML and JSON. We're going to persist those in etcd. We're going to keep versions of those and changes.
How do you then enforce that the etcd is encrypted at rest, etc.?
Well, the logic around it could read the policy and actually confirm whether it's encrypted, but it's a fair point. I guess we'll get out a second etcd and then we'll make them watch each other.
Yes.
Panopticon all the way. All right. So data controller. Basically, the data controller is a second well-defined role. The data controller is responsible for implementing the appropriate technical and organizational measures. Notice this is the European form of organizational measures, not the V, in case you're comfortable with the US spelling. Sorry, that stuff stands out to me. In order to ensure that you're able to demonstrate that processing is performed in accordance with the regulation. So the data controller, I think, is the role that will create artifacts that are relevant to policy. Whatever language we define, whatever commands we define, whatever API we define, the data controller is the human being who's actually going to touch that stuff. So if we scroll down a little bit further, these use cases are denoted with a prefix of DC. So just a little bit further down, Howard, there's a couple of use cases that are listed out. All right. So DC1, she can create policies which will be carried out by the data processor. Quite literally, this is the person that writes whatever language we're going to describe to capture information that's interesting. I think that it's worth going into a bit more detail where DC1 actually gets refined into she can create policies for, and then each of the specific kinds of policies. And that was something I didn't have a chance to get to. But in a moment, we'll see kind of a list of some of the objects that Eric and I discussed would be interesting to try to enforce or control. So if we'll scroll down in just a moment, but just kind of a preview things like the API authentication or the network policy, for example. So I think that the use cases here for DC1 actually get broken out into sub-use cases for create policies for network policy that, and then kind of going back to maybe Sue's example for firewalls, right? Network policy that limits who can access the data endpoints. That's a component of data access. That's a component of what GDPR is trying to enforce. So I think a sub use case there, excuse me, is going to make sense. But I didn't have a chance to break that out, but that's kind of where that's headed. DC2, she can review the audit history for all managed policies and data. So understand who's actually been interacting with the policy system, what changes have been made. To Erica's point, you know, if etcd becomes a control point, both etcd becomes a point that must have enforcement applied to it, but also the source of truth of what has been done, then the architecture probably has to begin employing things like signed results or some signature mechanism where when the policy is carried out or when the policy is modified, then a signature is recorded, and at least, while we may not be able to prevent it from being tampered with, we need to at least understand whether it has been tampered with. So I think as part of the history of policy definition, policy enforcement, there has to be some level of non-repudiation in the system, some level of verifiable identity in the system that says Spike was responsible for this point in time adding a new policy. Here's the hash of the policy that he created, the RSA signature rather, that was signed by Spike's private key for the changes he made to the policy, so that we can actually go back with his public key and validate, is this correct, right?
Doesn't the API server spit out auditable logs for changes?
If you configure it, and I think it's now turned on by default, but then that also means that you have a system to collect those logs.
Right, exactly. But if we did that and made that system immutable, then you wouldn't necessarily have to try and deal with this idea of like etcd being like itself auditable.
You may leverage that flow of information as an audit history, which is great. But in etcd, what I'm actually trying to describe may be a little bit different. I want to make sure that if Erica creates a new policy, persists it, that there's some validatable signature that she made the change. When Spike comes along and makes this change for V2, I want to be able to see what are the two policies that you each created, and then some signature of that. So more so than just an audit log, there's actually a history that I can go through and see what was done. When Erica updates the policy, absolutely agree. We should rely on the existing auditing system to log the action that Erica took to create a new policy. And then when Spike actually goes into the system and updates it, we should see an audit action in the audit log that said Spike updated policy V1. But I should also be able to go in to whatever our data store is and validate that, yes, Erica actually signed this policy. She's the one who did it. She controlled her private key, or someone who had stolen her private key who was impersonating her, but mostly we think it's her. And then Spike actually made the update because we can validate that he had control of Spike Curtis's private key.
Is that actually required by the legislation, that I have a complete history of all changes to policy, including the full content of the policy, sort of back in time?
The idea of the full change in policy, not so much. The read-write access logs for data is there. I think if you go back up to the data protection officer, she has both the action of monitoring compliance. And I think, to me, part of monitoring compliance is to understand, did someone make changes to the policy that were not approved or not in line with the expectations of the DPO?
Yeah, I think the idea is like, you can't, if you're asked by the authorities, like, did someone access this piece of data? You can't just be like, I don't know. You have to actually be able to kind of somewhat definitively prove that no one did. How you can do that will basically has to involve a certain amount of history and showing that you enforced the right policies.
So we need like blockchain for the logging, policy logging.
Definitely, that's exactly what we need.
Yeah.
Actually, I was thinking on the cryptography front, the update framework has some of these ideas kind of in it. Perhaps it was more of a narrower focus, but that'd be cool to check out actually, and possibly if we were to want to go down some of the more cryptographic verification, a good first case around.
I think that actually would be a pretty neat configuration. Now, I don't know that I would think it's required. I think Spike's on the right point that, you know, how much of this is sexy technical engineering that sounds fun versus practical reality, you know, meets men or meets the use case without necessarily being over-engineered. Completely on board with that. I think from my perspective, I do think that having a history of policy is good. And I think having some basic notion of this policy really was created or updated or modified by a particular person. The read-write access logs, I think, aren't going to have that level of non-repudiation, right? I think it'll simply be, we have an access log hit to a REST API that said get/user/Spike Curtis, or Spike Curtis's ID or whatever. And we know that that was accessed on a certain date from an origin IP of XYZ. And I think that would technically meet kind of what GDPR is after, that someone read a particular piece of user data at a particular point in time, or again, an HTTP request in an access log that said delete/user/Erica. We'd know that, you know, her information was actually deleted, and we have that in our access logs.
Okay, so what would be the action items in this use case?
So I think part of it is, if you scroll down, there's a couple of areas that we highlighted as focus areas.
Mm-hmm.
And I think continuing to enumerate these and trying to describe what I think we wanted to get to is, for any one of these particular areas, could we actually come up with a policy, even, you know, not just written in natural language, that would say these kind of concerns must be enforced or met or followed for these objects or these things. So maybe part of the role-based access control is who can access what. The network policy and firewall rules is kind of an interesting one. Persistent volume policy, kind of elaborating on that CSI directive to retain access logs for the data.
Mm-hmm.
So things like that. That to me is, I think, the next step.
Okay, great. This is great discussion. And the entertainment use case, Michael, do you think you could still do it, or maybe we should also?
We're out of time. It's 6 o'clock.
I think what happened is that.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Good.
I think the entertainment scenario we refactored into the capacity scenario simply because we weren't able to get the HBO team. So Eric and I teamed up on the compliance scenario.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, this way we are more. So as Spike just mentioned, thank you guys. We have run out of time, and this is absolutely great.
Sounds good. So I'll capture the recording, post it to the YouTube
items.
channel.
Yeah, and for the articles, I'm thinking I will just like CC in everyone on the meeting today, and you know, if and bandwidth, just helping out reviewing and, you know, contributing to the article. Okay.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.
Bye.
Good day.
Good day.